Hey, so I just wanted to address some things that I've wanted to address before, and this is going to be a really in-depth video talking about Joseph Smith's life. So I just really wanted to know what Joseph Smith was like according to his children or the women in his life. And so it's hard to make a video like this because it's hard to be a member of the church, especially if you're looking for work or trying to keep work or working with someone on something. There's so much judgment and so many bad feelings about it, which is just very sad. And you can't be online or be in a chat room without constantly hearing that Joseph Smith is a pedophile, that he's a sexual predator, comparing him to Nexium, that guy, Keith Raniere, who's compared to him recently, called a narcissist by this guy that actually is a doctorate in theology, but is a therapist. But he's a therapist, they don't diagnose people, but he decided to go ahead and diagnose Joseph Smith with narcissism. But as a member of the church, I wanted to know, what was his personality like? Was he abusive to his kids? Was he abusive to these women? Did he force them into this? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, what I found. I've been through a lot of abuse. I haven't had the worst life of anyone I know, but I won't go into detail, but I've definitely been through some really tough things. And it's very hard to be online, and if you watch YouTube videos, it's this trending thing to say, trigger warning, I'm going to say something really hard. But when you're a member of the church, they don't give you a trigger warning. They are just like, he's a pedophile, he did this, and they come up with all these things, and a lot of it is true. A lot of it is ellipses and just sort of quoting things, but I struggled. I was really afraid to read anything about polygamy because I don't know any polygamists. I did not grow up with that. I've said that before, but I'm really going to go deep into this. I've lightly touched this, and because I, was looking for work, that's hard. They might find this and not hire me. It's just, I'm tired of it now. I just want to just make this and just talk about it. And so really, I'm just going into what people said. I'm going to show my sources, and they have to be Mormon sources because the Mormons have the diaries of these people. You need to read what Mormons said because it's about Mormons, members of the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so we don't use that term anymore. They kind of ended up embracing it because it was interesting in their newspaper. They said, oh, Mormon just means more good. And they're kind of like, oh, haha, just kind of as a joke. And so they're like, okay, we'll call her. So it's a derogatory term. So I'm just going to start out with a little story that I found in here. This is the memoirs of President Joseph Smith III. So he was a part of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so he was born in 1832. Joseph Smith and Emma had lost 3 children and lost an adopted child. So they lost 4 kids, and then an adopted daughter, Julie, is the oldest. But the firstborn son to live to adulthood was Joseph Smith III. And then you've got, Frederick, and then Alexander, and then David Hiram. And those were all the kids that they had. And those are the only children that they've ever found Joseph Smith has fathered. And so, if you read through this, it's not pro-Brigham Young, but it's super interesting if you're trying to decode how the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints lived polygamy back then, and as opposed to how a lot of these other groups do today. And it is actually quite different as I've done my research. And so, how did he treat his son? But he does talk about the situation where he got into big trouble for getting ice out of the ocean, but he doesn't, out of the Mississippi. And his dad's really mad about him, but he never says my dad like hit me or anything. I don't find anything like that. And so a super interesting story, since I'm constantly told that Joseph Smith was a pedophile. One story that makes me think not is Joseph Smith III talking about how uncomfortable he was with Heber C. Kimball. One day and I think he'd been through some things. Like he almost was killed by a Missouri guard when his dad was taken away. Even Lucy Mack Smith witnessed this across the street. She's in the lodge, sees her son. They think their children are going to be killed, because they were just pointing guns at everyone. And they pointed the gun at the son, and it also had a knife on it. And it was just very traumatizing. He went through he had a lot of trauma. So I think something he did triggered him. That's my opinion. Just anyone in his space, I could just see the things that they've been through. A lot of horrible things happened in Missouri. A lot of militia did kill people. Joseph Smith III explains that Heber C. Kimball walked up to him, and it sounds like it was Nauvoo times, because things were good, and he just goes through this whole timeline, and he's just playing a game with these boys, but Heber C. Kimball puts his hand on his head, and he won't move his hand, and he just keeps talking to him, telling him to be good boys, make his dad proud, just typical things like that. And putting your hand on someone's head is not sexual abuse, but he did not like that. And he just said, "Get your hand off me," and just throws his hand off. And then he, of course, tells Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith gets his son. He said that he just sits down and talks to his son. He's like, "Well, I heard that you were rude to Heber C. Kimball." And he gives that whole story of what Heber C. Kimball said. And he's like, "Well, Dad, let me tell you how it was." And he's just like, it made me feel bad. And then Joseph Smith's just like, how did it make you feel bad, him touching you on your head, or just touching you? It made me feel bad when he touched me, and just really, so it just made me feel like, and Joseph Smith laughs. But there is, as far as Joseph Smith sounding super angry, that I was just like, whoa, is this story with Heber C. Kimball, that when he's in this meeting and people, I've listened to a lot of different historians, just that really great BYU historian. I'll kind of give a link to him there, and the name will come to me in a second. But I listened to like 8 hours of him talking about Joseph Smith. And this guy's like grandfather knew Brigham Young. So there's just so many stories. But but they all kind of know that there was this incident with Heber C. Kimball. Joseph Smith threw something at him. I think it was a piece of paper, had something written on there, and he was just like, "I didn't do anything. And it just, that was the biggest thing as far as him sounding angry. For some reason, he was angry at Heber C. Kimball, and I wonder if that was. I mean, he's like, his son is saying Heber C. Kimball made me feel icky. It's just like, he's gonna throw something in. I can see that. But Joseph Smith III doesn't say anything more happened, but his dad was really serious. I wonder if he was worried that something bad happened to his kid, and he was angry, and he was gonna get over here. "What'd you do with my kid?" And you're like, "What happened?" "I talked to my kid." He really listened to his kid. And then Joseph Smith III says, Heber C. Kimball never touched me again. Like, he knew and trusted his dad would care to listen to him, and that if someone touching him at all made him uncomfortable, it would stop. And it did. Okay, there was that story I found super interesting. And then another story Joseph Smith III talks about is this woman, Vienna Jackies, and just sort of the terminology of 1800s. I know I could talk about this forever. Spiritual wifery was considered very, very evil. It literally was like 1960s free love. I mean, if you watch Western movies, I mean, they were kind of living in the Western, prostitution happened a lot in America. Sadly, it did happen. But there was this organized thing called spiritual wifery, which J.C. Bennett did live, because that's in the minutes. In 1842, he comes to Nauvoo. He was only a member like a year, but he was like, "I come to rescue all of you saints that just got kicked out of Missouri." And he becomes mayor, J.C. Bennett. He leads the Nauvoo Legion. And he's like a doctor, and then he starts all these schools and all this stuff. But yeah, so he was a really bad guy. But he lived spiritual wifery. Anyone that lived that in 1842 was excommunicated all the way up until Joseph Smith's death, and it was men that lived spiritual wifery that killed Joseph Smith because he became mayor. They kicked J.C. Bennett out. Then they elected Joseph Smith as mayor. That's how he became mayor. And that's how he became a leader of the Nauvoo Legion, because J.C. Bennett had started running the Nauvoo Legion. Then they all wanted Joseph Smith to lead everything. They didn't trust anyone but Joseph Smith at that point, because there were a lot of women. There's these statements in 1844, right before the Nauvoo Expositor. Ironically, some of the wording in that was plagiarized in the Nauvoo Expositor a week later, claiming that's what Joseph Smith did, which is super bad. It's just unreal. But it's horrible. These statements of these women against this guy, Chauncey Higbee, who did kill Joseph Smith, these weren't good guys. Like it's describing rape. Literally, it is very bad. It's not super graphic because it's the Nauvoo neighbor. These Nyman girls, this whole story is way worse than what's published in the Nauvoo Neighbor, but they were, taken into basically a prostitution house by Chauncey Higbee. And he's saying, oh, I'm taking you to the spelling school, but let's go here first. And this woman, Catherine Warren, she lost her husband at Hans Mill. And yeah, it just was really bad. And you got Sarah Miller. So there's just 4 women describing Chauncey Higbee, telling them Joseph Smith lives this too. And they say this is spiritual wifery. That's how the word that they all use towards this behavior that Chauncey Higbee is living, because there's no commitment and there's gonna be no babies. Now, what's more tempting to men? Being committed to a bunch of women, having to deal with their emotions, live with them, provide for them, and take care of like 50 children. That's how many children Brigham Young had. I mean, Joseph Smith only had 4. And so you see why a lot of people have a hard time believing that he ever lived plural marriage. And so I'm going to get into that in a second here. But yeah, spiritual wifery was denounced in spring 1844. Okay, and so if you watch Fair Mormon movie videos on YouTube, they explain this, and people get, I find different comments. I try to explain, they're like, this is mental gymnastics. It doesn't make any sense. It is confusing because Joseph Smith III was confused. And so an interesting conversation in the memoirs is with this woman, Vienna Jackies, where she is talking to Joseph Smith III, and she actually never married. And she's defending plural marriage to him, though. Even though she's not a plural wife, she's just saying it's good, it's holy, it's not a bad thing. But then somehow he brings up spiritual wifery, and she's like, whoa. She starts shaking and crying, talking to him, and she's like, oh no, I talked to your mother about that, and it's just really, really bad. Your mother said if anyone comes to your door, and according to Meg Stout's blog, like they were called strikers, like they're coming to people's doors and doing things like that, and really horrible things. And but then Joseph Smith, so there's that whole thing. But yeah, Joseph Smith III is like, he's writing this. It's such a good second source, because he's like, she makes no sense, because she's saying it's good, then she says it's bad, but he doesn't make that distinction. But he quotes her really well. I don't think he is dishonest. I think it's worth it to thumb through that book. You can kind of find stuff that is interesting. So I did. So that story of Vienna Jackie's, he's like, I don't see, but he quotes her so well that you see, she's saying plural marriage is good, so spiritual wife did bad. When Emma Smith dies, she's on her deathbed and she's sick, and Joseph Smith III is interrogating her. His mother just really wants to know, she does say there was no revelation on spiritual wifery, but she uses the word spiritual wifery. But when she talks about plural marriage, she says, well, yeah, we did. There was something about that, but if people lived it right, it could be okay. But they won't. She talked about spiritual wifery, which is not polygamy. A lot of people, even in the church, don't understand that. But you need to understand that it's not the same thing. And so Joseph Smith talks about on this Maid of Iowa speech that he gives, that people criticize him because he is quoting Paul, boasting, and then he boasts. What you don't understand is how, one, it's not a quote. They did not have shorthand until the 1850s. They had different versions. They were trying to figure it out. But if you go to the church history of the church, where that initially was put, it's called a synopsis. The synopsis it's not a quote. And then if you go to the Joseph Smith Papers, this whole Maid of Iowa speech, you can see all the different handwriting. It's kind of hard to know, but I don't think it is all wrong. And then when you understand, he starts talking about spiritual wifery, just like how these men he talks about William Law. They're mad at him for not countenancing, not supporting their behavior and living how they're living. So he is saying they're living something really bad. You understand that those are different. And then eternity only sealings. Also, I can give you a page number in here where he brings it up, and he's just like, what is all of this? What is this? It is confusing. And he's like, eternity only. They're like, that doesn't mean you're married. It does not mean you're married, kid. If eternity only, no, it doesn't. And even if I talk to Utahns, I don't have ancestors that were Mormon pioneers, but they explained, it's like, we're friends. Eternity is not a physical thing. I think you even got, oh goodness, I can almost think of her exact name, that was married to Joseph Smith's cousin that Emma was explaining. She just, in her mind, all of the wives were just eternity only. Like, oh, none of them are going to move in. They're not going to have kids. Like, this is just eternity only. Which really, in a way, is so similar. If it was just that, like in Helen Mar Kimball's case, in her case, it was like being a Mormon nun, because she's not going to be married until the next life, unless she gets a time sealing when she's 18, which is what they did. And so I found this whole Fair Mormon video where Brigham Young was talking about, they were quoting Brigham Young, and Brigham Young quoting Joseph Smith saying, you can get sealed when they're younger, but when they're 18, then it's time, and then you have children. They didn't have contraception back then. And so anyway, those were several terms that are supported by, I think, a good source, because you don't get anyone that's more anti-Brigham Young. I don't think he hated him, but he just didn't, you try to say, oh, you're gonna read Mormon sources. I mean, he is a Mormon, but he's a good second source, so he really supports that. He doesn't understand it, but he's quoting these people, and you understand, in 1860s, just a few years after Joseph Smith died, spiritual wifery is bad, it's horrible, and people are shaking and thinking it's awful. Eternity only does not mean you're married. It does not mean spiritual wifery, and so a lot of people think those are the same thing. It's just not. And so Helen Mar Kimball explaining it wasn't romantic. I've read through her whole thing, her writings and letters. She wrote in a letter, a poem, just explaining her sealing to Joseph Smith was for eternity alone, and just how she felt like she was just confined. It sounds like she's describing the life of a nun, like she can't date, can't do anything. But then if you read the Nauvoo Neighbor, what happened to these Nyman sisters, and then you read more of this poem by Helen Mar Kimball, you understand that there were girls that had a horrible life and just horrible things happened. And I found them on, I tried to research them, and it sounds like Chauncey Higbee ruined their life. He did. But Helen Mar Campbell goes off and has a bunch of kids, so I don't think she had an abortion. You know, but you got Sarah Pratt explaining, you know, this whole story, and people try to say, oh, well, Joseph Smith killed babies, your church kills babies. I'm like, no, we do not. And I don't believe that I don't see any evidence of there being abortions, just how strongly Helen Mar Kimball talks against abortions and how it really was like, especially the 1830s, like you're gonna die, you know. I think by the late 1800s, they at least figured out sanitation. But it really was a new thing. They didn't understand. That's why a lot of women died in childbirth, or their babies died, because they didn't understand a lot of things, you know. And even in the 1950s, women dying from abortions, or even recently, you know, it's such a dangerous thing, even with all the technology we have. Just think about back then. And here's Sarah Pratt, he's just got 2 tools. This guy, that, what education does this guy have? Not much. So, but they would tell this whole story that, you know, it's like, who do you believe, you know? And so you could totally believe J.C. Bennett, and he did lie. I do believe that he was a liar, because he was in the Nauvoo neighbor a month before, just weeks before Joseph Smith died. These women's testimonies from 1842 explaining that, yeah, here's J.C. Bennett stating, but we've never heard this from Joseph Smith. They all explain that. And there's no story of Joseph Smith coming to women talking about spiritual life, and yeah, I'll let J.C. Bennett come and get rid of the baby. You know, it was no commitment. Women were being with other men, whereas plural marriage was the woman's only going to be with one guy that she's not going to see that much. So physically, it's a totally different story. And so when you have all these denials, things make me decode plural marriage back then. That's why Eliza R. Snow is denying J.C. Bennett's claim. And Emily Partridge lived in Joseph Smith's house. Like, did he have self-control? I think he lived with her for years before they got married. And they asked her in the Temple Act case if anything happened before then. Like, did they sleep together before they were married? And just, oh, no. Did not. And they just keep asking, well, when did he propose? Well, first they asked, okay, when were you married? 1843. So spring 1843, you know, she was sealed for time in y'all eternity with Heber C. Kimball there and Joseph Smith there. And then a month or two later, she's married by this guy, Judge Adams, like an actual judge. Emma, knowing this girl's lived in that house, I think she really trusted her. Like, she was like her, helping her take care of baby Don Carlos, and Don Carlos died. You know, I think they were very close. And so she was really thinking, okay, I can handle this. I can live polygamy, plural marriage. They called it celestial marriage. They wouldn't call it polygamy. They actually said polygamy was something else. They always denounced the word polygamy, even up until, you know, all these times of Joseph Smith III. It's celestial marriage, not polygamy. And they had their reasons for that. But, you know, then this guy, Judge Adams, is there. And then that makes sense to me that I think Emma was like, I want this to be legal. I don't want this just to be some church marriage, you know. And so I've heard people try to get, well, none of these were why these are all your spiritual wives, because J.C. Bennett said that. I don't believe that. And so, yeah, so then they were married by Judge Adams. And her sister there were married to Joseph Smith, and they were I think she was 19, her sister was like 2 years older, Eliza. And but they're like, when did he first bring this up? And they really get into so much detail with her. They really interrogate Emily Partridge. And so she goes back and forth. I won't try to quote her, but it was a full year when he first almost proposed to her. And so what had happened, I think at that point, I'm just trying to figure out like what's going on. It's like 1842. Eliza Snow's moved in. She was a tiny Trinity life, and then she's moved out at some point. But, you know, I think it'd be hard to live in a house and not realize something could be happening with someone else, you know. And she says that. She's like, I was kind of thinking maybe there's some truth to some things that are being said. Not that he's living spiritual life free, but and so he just walks up to her and hands her a piece of paper and says, I want you to read this, and I want you to burn it. Like, I could die if you can't, if you have to keep the secret. You can't go tell all your friends because I will get killed. And she says, I don't want that. I don't want to read it. She's like, I'm scared. Okay, let's see if Joseph Smith's a narcissist and how he responds to her. And he just looks at her and he says, do you want me to stop talking? And she says, yes. He stops talking, walks away. He doesn't bring it up again. He never brings it up again. She does a year later. And then she's at Heber C. Kimball's house and they get married, and then they get married like with a judge, And so polygamy, plural marriage, actually wasn't illegal. And I think Emma kind of knew that. So they asked him, Emily Partridge, when he proposed to you, was he coming on to you? Did he put his arm around you? Was he in the habit of doing that? Did he hold your hand? Did you sleep together before you were married? She's like, no, because she had moved in. Her father died in 1840, and she moved in soon after to help take care of baby Don Carlos, who ended up dying in 1841, and she doesn't get married till 1843, and she's just still living there, kind of helping out with the kids. But they were hiding it. And so it's really interesting to see, like, well, all these wives, they all kind of say, like, he didn't, according to Joseph Smith III, he was asking. Like, well, why aren't there any kids? Why aren't there any kids? I mean, a lot of people today, oh, well, they had abortions. Kind of like today. Is that just easy to do? No, not back then. I think, it's interesting it's hard for people to comprehend. How could he have all these wives and nothing much happen? But I think it's possible. I was kind of surprised just watching this show called Married at First Sight, where this girl who was a virgin married this guy who was not. And, but they slept together in the same bed, but she didn't lose her virginity. And they were married at first sight for a few months. And then they got divorced. And so, I think it's very possible that he could have respected several of these women that he was married to really only for a year. And most of them didn't even live in the same house as him, and he's busy. And then you've got really these 3 women that did live in the house at the Temple Lot case, and just describe him as being respectful. There's no story of anything physical happening with any women before he marries them. But I think it's highly possible that he just kind of like that guy and Married at First Sight that had been with a bunch of women, wasn't going to force, I don't think, I've heard people say, oh, back then all men, it was just rape was normal in a marriage. I don't think so. And according to Lucy Walker, she said, Joseph Smith said, a lot of men are going to be surprised when they wake up in the resurrection to not be with their wives, because if they didn't treat their wife well, God's not going to let them be together. And that sort of seemed a thing that was in Lucy's life. She knew, and she married Heber C. Kimball. I don't actually think he was a bad guy. And on his deathbed, his last words to Lucy Walker, who was married to Joseph Smith, was like, I hope that when I see him soon, I'm dying, that he thinks that I was as kind and nice to you as I possibly could be. Now, do all men that live polygamy live it like Joseph Smith? No. And does Joseph Smith live it how other men live polygamy today? Because ironically, when you understand these words, I think unfortunately, like how there is that confusion, even Joseph Smith III was confused. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there are men today that read J.C. Bennett's book and go, oh, I think he really was Chauncey Higbee, so I can go be like Chauncey Higbee, because J.C. Bennett said he was like that, and he was like Jeffrey Epstein, and they're just kind of like, yeah, I like Joseph Smith for that, because I'm really imperfect, and he was imperfect like me, but they're really creeps, you know? Does that happen? Yeah, I think that's what's happened with a lot of these breakaway groups, where they use the word spiritual wifery. They call them their spiritual wives, and a lot of them do live spiritual wifery, but the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints did denounce that, and I think that's how you've got this just pile up, just snowballing effect of abuse in a lot of these groups. Because polygamy on its own is really hard. But once they start thinking, oh, well, Joseph lives spiritual wifery because J.C. Bennett said he did, and I'm just going to believe that he did, so I'm going to live that too. That's where it's really scary, in my opinion. Because I don't think a man can love and respect a woman that he's okay with passing around with his buddies. So, I mean, the FLDS church, I've heard of, you know, their leader forcing women to do that, which is really, I think that's where it gets really dark at that point. But that's just my opinion. So it's gonna be a little bit longer of a video. I'm gonna kind of throw these things in here.